The walls of Constantinople trembled under the relentless pounding of Ottoman cannons. The year was 1453, and after nearly 2,000 years of standing as the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the city was on the brink of collapse. Inside, desperate defenders, soldiers, citizens, even monks clutched their weapons, knowing this might be their final night. Outside, the forces of Mehmed II, the young and ambitious Ottoman Sultan, pressed forward, fueled by a hunger for conquest. This wasn't just a battle for a city, it was a clash of empires, religions, and destinies. The fall of Constantinople would change the world forever, marking the end of an era and the birth of a new one. For centuries, Constantinople had been the glittering jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a city of unmatched wealth, culture, and strategic power. It stood as the last remnant of Rome's glory, a bridge between Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam. But by the 15th century, the empire was a shadow of its former self, its territories shrinking under relentless pressure from the rising Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans, once a small nomadic tribe, had grown into a formidable empire, and their eyes were fixed on Constantinople, the ultimate prize. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic sieges, a battle that would test the limits of human endurance, ingenuity, and courage. Tonight, we're stepping back into those final, desperate hours before the city fell. What was it like to stand on those crumbling walls, hearing the shouts of the enemy drawing closer? How did the Byzantines, outnumbered and outgunned, hold out for nearly 2 months against overwhelming odds? And what secrets, strategies, and betrayals sealed their fate? This is the story of the fall of Constantinople, not just as a historical event, but as a human drama filled with heroism, tragedy, and moments that still echo through time. By the end, you'll understand why this single day reshaped the course of history, and why its legacy still matters to us now. So let's begin where the story reaches its climax, under the smoke-filled sky of a city fighting for its life. Constantinople at its height was more than a city, it was a living legend. Imagine walking its wide, marble-paved streets, passing markets overflowing with silks from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. The air hummed with a dozen languages, from Greek and Latin to Arabic and Persian, as merchants haggled beneath colonnades adorned with ancient statues. At the heart of it all stood the Hagia Sophia, its towering dome a masterpiece of engineering, its golden mosaic shimmering in the candlelight. Built in just 5 years under Emperor Justinian, it was a symbol of divine ambition, a church so grand it was said angels guided its construction. But Constantinople's power wasn't just in its beauty, it was in its bones. Perched on a peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, the city was a fortress. 3 layers of massive walls, some dating back to the 5th century, stretched for miles, studded with watchtowers and gates. The Theodosian walls alone were nearly 5 meters thick in places, a seemingly impenetrable shield against invaders. And then there was the chain, a colossal iron barrier stretched across the Golden Horn, capable of sealing off the city's vulnerable harbor at a moment's notice. For centuries, this was the crossroads of the world. Scholars in its libraries preserved the works of Plato and Aristotle while Europe languished in the so-called Dark Ages. Emperors held court in the Great Palace, its floors paved with intricate mosaics, its throne room equipped with mechanical lions that roared at foreign ambassadors. The city's workshops produced exquisite ivories, perfumes, and the famed Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary weapon that could burn even on water. Yet by the 15th century, the empire's glory had faded. Plagues, crusades, and constant wars had chipped away at its strength. Where once 1 million people thrived, now barely 50,000 remained. But even in decline, Constantinople held an aura of myth. To Mehmed II, capturing it wasn't just a military goal, it was about claiming the legacy of emperors of Rome itself. and as the Ottomans massed outside the walls, the city's inhabitants knew one truth: if these streets fell, the world they knew would vanish forever. The story of the Ottomans begins not with thundering cannons or towering palaces, but in the rugged hills of northwestern Anatolia, where a minor Turkic chieftain named Osman carved out a tiny principality in the late 13th century. At first, his ambitions seemed modest, just another warlord in a fractured landscape. But Osman possessed something rare, a vision that stretched beyond the next battle. He forged alliances with local Ghazi warriors, Muslim fighters drawn to the promise of holy war and conquest, and together they began chipping away at the weakened Byzantine frontier. What started as raids soon turned into territory, and by the time Osman died in 1326, he'd laid the foundations of an empire that would shake the world. His successors turned momentum into mastery. Orhan, Osman's son, captured the critical city of Bursa, transforming it into the empire's first capital and a hub of trade and culture. Murad I pushed into Europe, smashing Serbian armies at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 and establishing a foothold in the Balkans. But it was under Mehmed II, the brilliant, ruthless sultan history would call the Conqueror, that the Ottomans truly became an unstoppable force. By the time he turned 21, Mehmed had spent years studying ancient military treatises, Islamic law, and even Italian Renaissance engineering. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a polymath obsessed with a single goal: taking Constantinople. The Ottomans didn't rise by brute strength alone. Their military was a marvel of innovation, blending traditions from across Eurasia. Their janissaries, elite infantry units, were recruited through the Devsham system, taking Christian boys from conquered territories and training them as fiercely loyal soldiers. These weren't just troops, they were a standing army, disciplined and deadly, armed with early gunpowder weapons that outpaced outdated medieval tactics. Meanwhile, Ottoman engineers mastered siegecraft, building massive bombards capable of shattering stone walls. One cannon, cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban, could hurl a 600-kilogram stone ball over a mile. But the empire's true genius lay in its adaptability. Unlike rigid European feudal systems, the Ottomans absorbed the best ideas from every culture they encountered. Byzantine bureaucracy, Persian court rituals, Arab scholarship, all were woven into a uniquely flexible administration. Taxes were levied fairly by the standards of the time, and non-Muslim communities lived under a system of millets, allowed to govern their own affairs in exchange for loyalty. This wasn't just tolerance, it was strategy. Stability meant prosperity, and prosperity fueled further conquest. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans controlled trade routes linking 3 continents, from the spice markets of Aleppo to the silver mines of the Balkans. Their navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean, while their spies and diplomats outmaneuvered European rivals. When Mehmed finally marched on Constantinople in 1453, he didn't just bring an army, he brought the accumulated might of an empire that had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of domination. The Byzantines, for all their courage, weren't just facing a warlord, they were facing the future. From the moment Mehmed II took his first breath in 1432, his life was intertwined with destiny. Born in Edirne's opulent palace, the son of Sultan Murad II, he was groomed for power with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Tutors drilled him in mathematics, philosophy, and languages fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and even some Latin and Greek, while military strategists schooled him in the art of war. But Mehmed wasn't just educated, he was forged. By age 12, his father sent him to rule Amasya, a turbulent frontier province, where he learned firsthand how to crush rebellions and outmaneuver rivals. This wasn't just training, it was a test, and the boy who would become the conqueror passed it with ruthless brilliance. What set Mehmed apart wasn't just his intellect or his bloodline, it was his singular fixation. From childhood, he devoured histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, but one story consumed him: the failed Arab sieges of Constantinople centuries earlier. The city became his white whale, a symbol of imperial legitimacy. To Mehmed, capturing it would prove the Ottomans weren't just another step empire, they were the heirs of Rome. When he ascended the throne at 19, after his father's sudden abdication, his first act was chillingly clear. He ordered the execution of his infant half-brother, eliminating any threat to his rule. Mercy had no place in his vision. Preparation for the siege revealed Mehmed's genius. He knew Constantinople's walls had repelled invaders for 1,000 years, so he turned to innovation. When a Hungarian engineer named Orban offered to build him a cannon unlike anything the world had seen, Mehmed emptied his treasury to fund it. The result was a 27-foot-long monstrosity that took 60 oxen to transport, its stone shots capable of reducing towers to rubble. But cannons alone wouldn't suffice. Mehmed studied the city's weaknesses like a surgeon probing for a pulse. The Golden Horn's chain prevented naval attacks, so he orchestrated one of history's most audacious maneuvers, dragging 70 ships overland on greased logs to bypass the barrier entirely. His psychological warfare was just as calculated. He spread rumors of invincibility, circulated prophecies of the city's fall, and even dressed as a common soldier to inspect trenches undercover. While the Byzantines clung to hope of European rescue, Mehmed exploited their divisions, bribing Genoese mercenaries and isolating Emperor Constantine XI. By the time the siege began in April 1453, Mehmed had turned the odds in his favor through sheer will. He didn't just want victory, he needed it. To him, Constantinople wasn't merely a city. It was the missing piece in a puzzle only he could see, the creation of a world empire. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former greatness, a flickering candle where once there had been a bonfire. Its decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, a cascade of crises that left the empire hollowed out and vulnerable. Political instability had become the norm, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. Between 1391 and 1453 alone, the throne changed hands nearly a dozen times, often through violence or betrayal. Court intrigue was so rampant that one observer compared it to a nest of scorpions, where even the most trusted advisors might strike without warning. Emperor John VIII, desperate for military aid against the Ottomans, journeyed to Italy and signed the controversial Union of Florence, pledging allegiance to the Pope in exchange for support. But the move backfired spectacularly. Orthodox clergy and citizens saw it as a betrayal of their faith, sparking riots in Constantinople's streets. The empire was tearing itself apart from within. Economic decay accelerated the collapse. Once, Byzantium had controlled the wealth of 3 continents, its gold coins the standard of trade from London to Baghdad. But centuries of war and mismanagement drained the treasury. By the 1450s, the empire's annual revenue was a pitiful 30,000 gold coins, less than what a single Venetian merchant might earn in a year. The grand palaces and public works crumbled from neglect, while the once bustling markets of Constantinople grew quiet. Desperate emperors resorted to melting down church relics for gold, even stripping lead from rooftops to fund defenses. Trade routes that had fed the city's prosperity now lay in Ottoman hands, and without them, the empire withered like a plant cut off from water. Territorial losses compounded the crisis. At its height, Byzantium stretched from southern Italy to Syria, but by the 14th century it was reduced to little more than Constantinople itself, a few scattered islands, and the Peloponnese. The Ottomans chipped away at the remnants, swallowing cities one by one. Adrianople fell in 1361, Thessalonica in 1430, and each conquest tightened the noose. The Byzantines became like a homeowner barricaded in a single room while invaders claimed the rest of the house. Even their appeals for help grew pathetic. Emperor Constantine XI once wrote to European rulers pleading for any assistance, even a single ship, but received only hollow promises. Perhaps the empire's greatest weakness was its loss of identity. Byzantium had long seen itself as the spiritual heir of Rome, but by the end, that vision felt like a faded mural, still visible but crumbling at the edges. The population of Constantinople, once a melting pot of cultures, had dwindled to a fraction of its former size, with entire neighborhoods abandoned. The grand universities and libraries that had preserved ancient knowledge stood half empty, their scholars fleeing to Italy's budding Renaissance. Even the military, once the backbone of the empire, relied on foreign mercenaries, Genoese crossbowmen, Catalan knights, and Venetian sailors who fought for pay, not loyalty. Yet, in this long decline, there's a haunting resilience. The Byzantines knew their fate was sealed, but they refused to surrender quietly. Constantine XI, the last emperor, would ride out to meet his doom with dignity, fighting on the walls until the final hour. Their story isn't just one of failure, it's a testament to how empires, even in their twilight, cling to the fragments of what they once were. And as the Ottoman cannons roared in the spring of 1453, Constantinople's greatest strength became its tragic flaw. The memory of its own greatness made defeat unthinkable until it was inevitable. The cracks in Christendom ran deep long before the Ottomans reached Constantinople's walls. For centuries, the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had been drifting apart, not just in doctrine but in pride, politics, and raw human stubbornness. The Great Schism of 1054 had torn Christianity into two hostile camps, with the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople excommunicating each other in a blaze of mutual contempt. On paper, their disagreement centered on theological nuances, the filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, the use of unleavened bread in communion, but beneath the surface, this was a battle over authority. Who truly spoke for God? The East saw Rome as arrogant, meddling in affairs beyond its reach. The West viewed Byzantium as obstinate, clinging to outdated traditions while the world changed around them. When the Ottoman threat loomed large in the 14th century, desperate Byzantine emperors tried to mend this rift, hoping unified Christianity could save them. Emperor John VIII made the humiliating journey to Italy in 1439, kneeling before Pope Eugene IV at the Council of Florence. The terms were clear: Byzantium would accept papal supremacy, and in return, the West would send armies to defend Constantinople. The agreement sparked outrage back home. Monks denounced it as heresy, crowds rioted in the streets, and the Patriarch of Constantinople refused to sign. To many Orthodox faithful, submitting to Rome felt like surrendering their souls to save their bodies. Western Europe's response was lukewarm at best. A handful of Venetian ships and Genoese mercenaries trickled in, but the grand crusading armies Byzantium hoped for never materialized. Centuries of mistrust couldn't be erased by a single treaty, especially when Latin crusaders had already sacked Constantinople in 1204, looting its churches and desecrating its altars. That wound never fully healed. When the city's defenders peered over the walls in 1453 and saw Mehmed's forces gathering, they weren't just facing an enemy, they were staring at the consequences of a fractured faith. The tragedy lies in what might have been. Had East and West stood together, pooling their resources and strategies, the Ottomans might have been repelled. Instead, the Byzantines found themselves isolated, caught between an old rival they couldn't trust and a new conqueror they couldn't defeat. Even in Constantinople's final hours, as Venetian sailors fought alongside Greek soldiers on the crumbling walls, the lingering bitterness between them flared. Some whispered that the Genoese had cut deals with Mehmed, while others accused the Orthodox clergy of caring more about ritual purity than survival. The schism didn't just weaken Byzantium's alliances, it poisoned the well of solidarity when unity was the only hope left. This wasn't just a theological divide, it was a lesson in how pride and ancient grudges can shape history's turning points. The fall of Constantinople didn't merely mark the end of an empire, it underscored a painful truth. Sometimes the enemies within are just as dangerous as those outside the gates. Constantinople's legendary defenses were a masterpiece of ancient engineering designed to defy the mightiest armies. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, formed an imposing triple barrier stretching nearly 4 miles across the peninsula. The outermost wall stood low but bristled with defensive ditches and traps designed to break the momentum of charging troops. Behind it rose a second, taller wall studded with armored towers, perfect positions for archers to rain death on attackers. And finally, the innermost wall loomed nearly 12 meters high, its massive stone blocks fused with mortar so strong it withstood earthquakes for 1,000 years. These weren't just walls, they were a psychological weapon meant to crush the spirits of any army daring to approach, but walls alone couldn't save a city. Emperor Constantine XI knew this, and in the months before the siege, he orchestrated a desperate scramble to shore up weaknesses. Work crews labored day and night to patch crumbling sections, reinforcing gates with iron bars and stacking makeshift barriers of rubble where the masonry had decayed. The emperor, often seen personally inspecting the defenses in his plain armor, ordered trenches dug beyond the walls to slow Ottoman advances. Chains were checked and repaired, ensuring the massive barrier across the Golden Horn could still be raised to block enemy ships. Even the city's churches were stripped of valuables not for gold but for lead. Roofs were dismantled to melt down into bullets, a stark symbol of how far Byzantium had fallen. Constantine's greatest challenge wasn't stone or iron, it was manpower. With barely 7,000 soldiers to defend a perimeter that once required 20,000, he turned to unlikely allies. Venetian and Genoese mercenaries, their loyalty secured by promises of payment or plunder, took key positions along the walls. Ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, fishermen, even monks were handed spears and crossbows, their training rushed but their determination fierce. The emperor's plea for unity crossed social divides. Rich and poor stood side by side, knowing the stakes. Among them was Giovanni Giustiniani, a brilliant Genoese commander whose arrival with 700 professional soldiers offered a glimmer of hope. Placed at the most vulnerable section, the Mesotician, Giustiniani's leadership would prove crucial in the brutal days ahead. Yet for all Constantine's efforts, the defenses had a fatal flaw. They were built for a different era. The Theodosian walls had repelled Huns, Avars, and Arabs, but none of those foes had possessed anything like Mehmed's monstrous cannons. The Byzantines adapted as best they could, hanging bales of wool and hides over the ramparts to absorb cannonball impacts, building wooden stockades behind breaches to create kill zones. But every repair was a race against time, every reinforcement a temporary fix. The emperor's leadership was unwavering, but as the Ottoman army assembled beyond the horizon, one question haunted the city. Could ingenuity and courage hold back the tide of gunpowder and steel? Mehmed II didn't just bring an army to Constantinople, he brought a revolution in warfare. At the heart of his strategy was Orban's colossal cannon, a technological terror unlike anything the medieval world had seen. Cast from bronze and requiring a team of 60 oxen to transport, this monstrous weapon could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton, each impact shaking the Theodosian walls to their foundations. But Mehmed knew brute force alone wouldn't crack a city that had resisted sieges for centuries. His genius lay in combining overwhelming firepower with relentless innovation. While the cannons pounded the land walls, his fleet tightened a noose around the Golden Horn, cutting off supply lines and choking the city's lifeline to the outside world. The real stroke of brilliance, though, was the audacious naval maneuver that stunned Constantinople's defenders. The Byzantines had long relied on the massive iron chain across the Golden Horn to keep enemy ships at bay. Mehmed refused to play by their rules. Under cover of darkness, Ottoman engineers greased wooden tracks with animal fat and hauled 70 warships overland, bypassing the chain entirely. By dawn, the horrified citizens looked out to see an entire fleet looming in their supposedly secure harbor. a tactic so bold, so unprecedented, it shattered their morale overnight. Psychological warfare became Mehmed's silent weapon. He spread rumors of invincibility, whispering prophecies of the city's inevitable fall through captured spies and defectors. His camp buzzed with staged displays of power, troops marching in endless formations, engineers building siege towers taller than the walls, and at night, the eerie glow of countless campfires stretching to the horizon. He even dressed as a common soldier to move among his troops unnoticed, listening for dissent while fostering an aura of omnipresence. But perhaps his most devastating innovation was time itself. Where previous attackers had grown impatient and retreated, Mehmed settled in for a grueling 2-month siege. His sappers dug tunnels beneath the walls, forcing the exhausted defenders to countermine in claustrophobic underground battles. Disease and hunger gnawed at the city's resolve, while Mehmed's supply lines stretched unbroken back to Ottoman territory. Every day, every hour, the pressure mounted not just on the walls but on the minds of those clinging to them. This wasn't just a siege, it was a masterclass in the art of breaking civilizations. The first week of April 1453 brought an eerie stillness to the land outside Constantinople's walls, the calm before the storm. Mehmed's vast army, numbering over 80,000, fanned out in a crescent formation stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. His elite janissaries took position facing the vulnerable Mesotitian section of the land walls, while artillery batteries were hauled into place with meticulous precision. The Sultan himself pitched his red and gold tent atop a hill near the gate of St. Romanus, close enough to watch the bombardment's effects but safely beyond the range of Byzantine arrows. Every morning at dawn, his men raised the Ottoman flag with elaborate ceremony, its crescent moon glinting in the sunlight, a deliberate psychological stroke to remind the defenders of the power arrayed against them. On the 6th of April, the silence shattered. Orban's great cannon roared to life, its thunderclap echoing across the plains as the first 600-kilogram stone ball hurtled toward the Theodosian walls. The impact sent shockwaves through the city, toppling nearby buildings and leaving a crater where solid masonry had stood moments earlier. But this was no single strike. Mehmed's gunners had perfected a relentless rotation. While one cannon cooled, another fired, maintaining a barrage so continuous that survivors later described it as an unceasing hell of noise and dust. The Byzantines scrambled to patch breaches each night, stacking rubble, timber, and even sacks of wool to absorb the blows, only to see their repairs obliterated by morning. Yet the walls weren't the only target. Mehmed's fleet, now controlling the waters beyond the Golden Horn, launched incendiary attacks on the seaward defenses, raining Greek fire, ironically a Byzantine invention back upon its creators. The Ottoman archers added to the chaos, lofting arrows in high arcs to pepper the defenders atop the ramparts. Amid the chaos, the Sultan's sappers began their grim work, tunneling beneath the foundations to plant explosive charges. The Byzantines countered with desperate measures, lowering brave volunteers in baskets to pour boiling pitch into the tunnels or engaging in knife fights in the claustrophobic darkness underground. What made these opening days so terrifying wasn't just the scale of destruction, but its calculated rhythm. Mehmed wasn't relying on brute force alone. He was testing responses, probing for weak points like a surgeon locating a nerve. When defenders concentrated at one breach, he shifted fire to another. When they grew accustomed to daytime assaults, he ordered midnight bombardments to deny them rest. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Each new explosion chipped away at hope. Each repaired breach felt more fragile than the last. By the end of April, the once proud walls resembled a broken smile, gaps yawning open where mighty towers had stood for a millennium. The siege had barely begun, but already Constantinople's fate hung by a thread. The Golden Horn should have been Constantinople's lifeline, a sheltered harbor where supply ships could slip past the Ottoman blockade, where fishing boats might still feed a starving city. Instead, it became a battleground that defied the laws of medieval warfare. A massive iron chain, its links each as thick as a man's forearm, stretched across the water's entrance, buoyed by wooden floats. This simple but brilliant barrier had repelled invaders for centuries, forcing enemy fleets to confront the city's sea walls head-on. Mehmed's navy quickly learned its limits. In early April, an Ottoman squadron of 30 ships attacked the chain, only to be met by a storm of Greek fire from Byzantine defenders. The flaming liquid clung to hulls and sails, turning the water into a sheet of fire as sailors leaped into the sea to escape the inferno. Frustration gnawed at Mehmed as his naval commanders faltered. The admiral in charge, a seasoned veteran named Boltoglu, led a second assault with larger galleys, but the confined waters of the Golden Horn played to the defenders' advantage. Faster Byzantine and Italian ships darted between the bulky Ottoman vessels, ramming their oars and boarding with brutal efficiency. When Boltoglu limped back to camp with scorched ships and broken morale, Mehmed's response was chilling. Witnesses claimed the Sultan ordered the admiral tied to a stake and whipped in front of the entire army, a grim lesson in the cost of failure. But Mehmed wasn't a man who accepted defeat. While his cannons hammered the land walls, he convened his engineers in secret. The solution they devised was so audacious it bordered on madness. If the chain couldn't be broken, they'd go over it. Under cover of darkness, thousands of laborers began carving a path through the hills behind Pera, the Genoese-held district north of the Golden Horn. They laid wooden rollers greased with ox fat, creating a makeshift ramp nearly a mile long. Then, as dawn broke on the 22nd of April, Constantinople's defenders woke to an impossible sight: dozens of Ottoman warships being hauled uphill by teams of oxen, ropes creaking under the strain, their hulls groaning as they inched over the ridge. By noon, 70 ships had been dragged across land and launched into the Golden Horn's inner waters, bypassing the chain entirely. The psychological blow was catastrophic. Genoese merchants in Pera, who'd promised neutrality, watched in stunned silence as Mehmed's fleet reassembled behind their walls. Byzantine commanders scrambled to reposition their outnumbered ships, but the calculus had changed. Now the Ottomans controlled both sea and land, tightening their grip like a noose. Mehmed celebrated by erecting a battery of cannons on the northern shore, their barrels trained on the city's vulnerable sea walls. The Golden Horn, once a symbol of security, had become yet another front in a battle where the rules kept changing, and Mehmed kept rewriting them. Giovanni Giustiniani arrived in Constantinople not out of loyalty to the Byzantines, but for the oldest motivator in warfare, gold. A seasoned mercenary from Genoa, he was a rarity, a professional soldier in an age where most armies were cobbled together from conscripts and feudal levies. When Emperor Constantine XI offered him the staggering sum of 2,000 gold coins per month to lead the city's defense, Giustiniani didn't hesitate. He brought 700 well-trained men, clad in steel plate armor that gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, their crossbows and halberds a stark contrast to the motley weapons clutched by Byzantine civilians. From the moment he stepped onto the battlements, he took command with the cool efficiency of a man who'd spent his life studying war. The Mesotician, the central stretch of the Theodosian walls, became his domain. This was the city's weakest point, low, aging, and already showing cracks from previous sieges. Giustiniani transformed it into a fortress within a fortress. He positioned his Genoese crossbowmen in staggered rows to maintain constant volleys, their bolts capable of piercing Ottoman chainmail at 100 paces. Behind them, laborers stacked barrels of sand to absorb cannon impacts, while teams of Greek fire operators crouched ready to douse any assault with liquid flame. But his greatest weapon was discipline. Where Byzantine troops often fought in chaotic clusters, Giustiniani drilled his men to rotate like clockwork, front ranks stepping back to rest while fresh soldiers took their place, creating an unbreakable rhythm. For nearly 7 weeks, his leadership held the line against overwhelming odds. When Ottoman sappers tunneled beneath the walls, Giustiniani led counter-mining parties himself, descending into the suffocating darkness with a dagger and a lantern. In one brutal underground skirmish, his men collapsed a tunnel, burying dozens of Ottoman engineers alive. Above ground, his presence became legendary. Dressed in full armor despite the spring heat, he moved along the ramparts like a specter, shouting orders in broken Greek and Italian, dragging wounded men to safety, and once even single-handedly repelling a ladder assault by hurling a cauldron of boiling oil onto the climbers. The defenders began calling him the Iron Wall, a nickname that spread through the Ottoman camp, where whispers painted him as an invincible demon. Then, on the morning of May 29th, fate twisted. A stray Ottoman arquebus shot, perhaps random, perhaps aimed by one of Mehmed's elite marksmen, struck Giustiniani where his breastplate met his armpit. The lead ball shattered bone, tearing through his lung. As he collapsed, blood bubbling at his lips, panic rippled through the defenders. His men carried him from the wall, their formation unraveling without his steady hand. The Genoese, seeing their leader fall, began retreating toward the harbor, convinced the battle was lost. Emperor Constantine, sword in hand, begged them to stay, but the damage was done. In warfare, morale is as vital as steel, and Giustiniani's fall severed the fragile thread holding Byzantine resistance together. Some claim he died on a Genoese ship fleeing the city. Others say he succumbed in a makeshift infirmary as Ottoman flags rose over the walls. What's undeniable is this: for 53 days, one man's skill and stubbornness had thwarted history's most powerful army. His injury didn't just wound a commander, it shattered the last illusion of hope. The Mesotician, the section he defended so fiercely, would be the first to fall that final morning, and as the Janissaries poured through the breach, the absence of Giustiniani's banner fluttering above the smoke told them everything they needed to know Constantinople was finally theirs. Dawn broke on May 29, 1453, with an eerie red glow, not from the sun, but from countless Ottoman campfires flaring to life across the plain. Mehmed had spent the night in restless preparation, issuing final orders to his commanders while dervishes whirled through the ranks, chanting prayers for victory. The Sultan knew this would be no ordinary assault. After 7 weeks of siege, his men were exhausted, supplies dwindling, and whispers of mutiny slithered through the camp. He needed one final, overwhelming push to break Constantinople's spirit. As the first light touched the shattered Theodosian walls, he unleashed hell. A thunderous cannon barrage signaled the start, but this time the guns served as diversion rather than destruction. Under cover of smoke and noise, wave after wave of Mehmed's irregular troops, Bashi Bazauks, drawn from the empire's fringes, surged toward the breaches. These weren't elite soldiers but desperate men lured by promises of plunder. They clambered over rubble and fallen comrades, met by a hailstorm of arrows, boiling oil, and the dreaded Greek fire. The Byzantines fought with the frenzied strength of those who have nothing left to lose. Monks swung maces alongside Venetian mercenaries. Women hauled stones to the ramparts to drop on attackers. For 2 brutal hours, the Bashi Bazauks threw themselves at the walls, their bodies piling so high they formed grotesque ladders for those behind them. Just as the defenders began to believe they might hold, Mehmed played his next card. With a blare of trumpets, the Anatolian troops advanced, better trained, better armed, their chainmail glinting under the rising sun. They struck where Giustiniani had fallen, the Mesoticians' defenses now frayed and leaderless. Constantine himself rushed to the gap, his purple cloak discarded for plain armor as he swung his sword alongside common soldiers. The fighting descended into nightmarish intimacy, men choking on dust and blood, stumbling over the dead as steel clashed against steel. Then came the moment that tipped the scales. Through the chaos, the Sultan's most feared force, the Janissaries, marched in perfect formation, their tall white hats bobbing like specters in the smoke. These were Mehmed's finest, raised from childhood for this very purpose. They vaulted over barricades with terrifying precision, their scimitars cutting through exhausted defenders. Near the Kirkaporta gate, a small group of janissaries discovered an unguarded postern left ajar, whether by negligence or betrayal, none would ever know. They slipped inside, raising the Ottoman banner atop a tower. The sight sent panic rippling through the city. Constantine, realizing the end was near, led a last desperate charge toward the breach. Witnesses would later claim he tore off his imperial insignia and plunged into the melee, vanishing beneath the tide of enemy soldiers. By mid-morning, the cry, "The city is taken," echoed through Constantinople's streets. What followed wasn't just defeat, but a visceral unraveling. Ottoman troops pouring through gaps, smashing into homes and churches, while citizens fled toward the harbor or knelt in prayer as the killing reached them. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia became a refuge for thousands, its massive doors barred until axes shattered the wood. Amid the bloodshed, Mehmed entered his prize at dusk, riding through the shattered gate of St. Romanus. He dismounted at the Hagia Sophia, where janissaries were already ripping down crosses and scattering marble chips from the altar. In a gesture blending ruthlessness and statesmanship, he halted the looting after 3 days, declaring the city's surviving buildings his personal property. Constantinople, now Istanbul, would rise again under Ottoman hands, its churches converted to mosques, its streets echoing with new calls to prayer. The last Roman emperor had fallen, but the conqueror who took his throne understood something profound. True victory wasn't just in the taking, but in the remaking of history itself. Emperor Constantine XI knew the end had come. As the Ottoman janissaries surged through the breaches on that final morning, he stood near the crumbling Mesotitian walls, his sword slick with blood, his armor dented from hours of desperate combat. Around him, the last of his loyal guards, Greek, Italian, even a few Turkish mercenaries who'd refused to abandon him, formed a shrinking circle. The air reeked of smoke and iron, the screams of the dying mingling with the triumphant cries of the invaders. Some begged him to flee while there was still time. The Venetian ships in the harbor might yet carry him to safety. The secret postern gates offered paths to escape. But Constantine would have none of it. "I cannot leave," he reportedly told his generals, his voice steady despite the chaos. "How could I face the mothers of those who died for this city if I abandoned them now?" A living emperor without an empire is no emperor at all. In that moment, he became more than a ruler, he became a legend. Stripping off his imperial insignia to blend with common soldiers, he led one last charge toward the breached Kirkaporta gate. Eyewitnesses, few of whom survived, would later disagree on the details. Some claimed he fell beneath a swarm of janissaries, his sword shattering as he swung at Mehmed's elite troops. Others swore they saw him vanish into the smoke, his body never found, giving rise to myths that he slept beneath the city like King Arthur, waiting to return in Byzantium's hour of greatest need. A haunting tale emerged among Greek refugees that an angel had snatched Constantine away at the final instant, transforming him into marble and sealing him beneath the Golden Horn's waters, where he would one day be awakened. The Ottomans, perhaps uneasy at the thought of such a defiant spirit, spread their own version. They claimed to have identified his body by the purple boots only an emperor could wear, and that Mehmed, in a rare moment of chivalry, ordered his head sent to the courts of Persia and Arabia as proof of victory. Yet no grave was ever confirmed, no relics recovered. It's this ambiguity that cemented his legacy. In death, Constantine achieved what he couldn't in life: immortality. Where his predecessors had bargained and compromised to preserve their shrinking empire, he chose to stand, knowing the cost. His final act wasn't just about defending stone walls, it was about dignity in the face of oblivion. Centuries later, historians still debate his choices. Was it folly to reject escape, denying Byzantium even the hope of a government in exile? Or was his refusal to surrender the ultimate act of kingship, a refusal to let 900 years of Roman continuity end with a whimper? One truth remains unshaken. On May 29, 1453, the last Roman emperor died as the first had lived, with a sword in his hand and an unbroken will. And in that, he ensured no conqueror could ever truly claim to erase him. The moment the Ottoman flag rose over Constantinople's broken walls, the city descended into chaos. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of unrestricted plunder, an ancient reward for conquest, and they descended on the city like a storm. Houses were ransacked, churches stripped of gold, and libraries set ablaze, their irreplaceable manuscripts curling to ash in the flames. The streets ran red as soldiers cut down anyone who resisted, while others rounded up survivors to be sold in slave markets. The Hagia Sophia, once the heart of Orthodox Christianity, became a scene of horror. Worshippers clinging to the altar were torn away, its mosaics smeared with blood, the very air thick with the screams of the vanquished. Yet amid this carnage, strange contrasts emerged. While drunken soldiers piled loot in the squares, Mehmed himself rode through the ruins with a growing sense of unease. He'd dreamed of capturing an imperial capital, not a corpse. When he reached the Hagia Sophia, he dismounted, scooped a handful of dirt from the ground, and sprinkled it over his turban, a gesture of humility before the weight of history. By the second day, as fires still smoldered, he issued decrees to halt the worst excesses. Looters caught harming children or destroying manuscripts were executed on the spot. Greek families hiding in cellars were astonished when Ottoman officers offered them bread and safe passage. The Sultan's pragmatism soon overshadowed the violence. He knew an empire couldn't be built on ashes. Architects and scholars were summoned from across the Ottoman lands to survey the damage, while craftsmen began repairing aqueducts and clearing rubble from the streets. Most strikingly, Mehmed sought out the city's surviving intellectuals, Orthodox priests, Jewish physicians, Italian cartographers, offering them pensions and positions in his new administration. A ruler without learned men, he reportedly said, is like a garden without water. Within weeks, an eerie normalcy returned. Markets reopened under Ottoman guards, their stalls now selling spices and silks alongside salvaged Byzantine heirlooms. The Hagia Sophia's crosses were replaced with crescents, yet its structure remained intact, its Christian mosaics merely plastered over rather than destroyed. For the displaced Greeks, this was both relief and reckoning. Their world had ended, yet life stubbornly persisted. Mehmed's genius lay in understanding that true conquest wasn't just about breaking a city, it was about binding its bones back together, with himself as the heir to all it had once been. The sack of Constantinople wasn't the end of a story. It was the brutal, messy birth of something new. Mehmed II entered Constantinople not as a mere conqueror, but as a man stepping into a destiny he'd envisioned since childhood. The dust of battle still hung in the air when he rode through the shattered St. Romanus Gate on the afternoon of May 29th, his white stallion picking its way past corpses and smoldering ruins. The streets that had resisted him for 53 days now lay broken beneath his horse's hooves, their once vibrant markets silent except for the occasional wail of survivors. His procession moved deliberately toward the heart of the city, the Hagia Sophia. This wasn't just a military victory march, it was a carefully staged transformation of power. When Mehmed dismounted before the great cathedral, the scale of his achievement must have struck him. The building's massive dome, which had dominated Constantinople's skyline for nearly 1,000 years, now bore the scars of battle, its golden mosaics dimmed by smoke, its marble floors sticky with the blood of refugees who'd sought sanctuary there. As he stepped inside, legend claims he paused to recite a verse from the Quran. Surely the mosques of God shall be maintained by those who believe in God. Then, with a gesture witnessed by his stunned generals, he scooped a handful of dirt from the floor and sprinkled it over his turban, a symbolic act of humility acknowledging the weight of history now resting on his shoulders. What followed was both pragmatic and profound. Mehmed ordered the immediate conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, but with unexpected restraint. Rather than destroying its Christian artwork, he had workers carefully plaster over the mosaics depicting Christ and the saints, preserving them beneath the surface like seeds waiting to sprout. The altar became the mihrab facing Mecca, the bells were replaced with the call to prayer, and the towering cross atop the dome gave way to a golden crescent. This wasn't erasure, it was transformation, a physical manifestation of his vision to absorb Byzantium's legacy rather than obliterate it. His actions in those first days reveal a ruler thinking far beyond the battlefield. While his troops still looted the outer districts, Mehmed toured the city's infrastructure, inspecting the cracked aqueducts, the neglected harbors, the crumbling forums where Byzantine emperors had once held court. He summoned Greek architects and surviving scholars, demanding lessons on the city's layout and history. To the astonishment of his advisors, he issued decrees offering safe passage home to any citizen who had fled, promising protection for their property and faith in exchange for loyalty. The message was clear: this wouldn't be a ruined trophy, but a living capital worthy of his burgeoning empire. By week's end, Mehmed stood atop the old imperial palace's ruins, gazing across the Golden Horn toward Pira's Genos towers. With a sweep of his hand, he outlined his plans not just to repair Constantinople, but to surpass its former glory. Here, he told his viziers, we will build a city that unites East and West, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews thrive under Ottoman justice. Historians would later call this moment the birth of Istanbul, but for Mehmed, it was something more personal, the fulfillment of a prophecy. He'd read in ancient texts that a ruler named Mehmed would one day take Constantinople, and now he'd cemented his place in that legend. The boy who'd studied Caesar's campaigns had become the sultan who'd done what Caesar never could, in a city that would henceforth bear his imprint on every stone. Niccolo Barbaro never intended to become history's witness. A Venetian surgeon stationed in Constantinople during the siege, he kept a diary not for posterity, but as a way to steady his nerves between shifts treating the wounded. His ink-stained pages, scribbled by candlelight in the frantic final weeks, offer one of the most visceral accounts of the city's last days. The cannons never ceased, he wrote, describing how the relentless bombardment left defenders deafened, their ears ringing even in rare moments of silence. His entries grow increasingly desperate notes of dwindling food supplies, of surgeons operating without anesthesia, of the eerie glow from Ottoman campfires lighting the nighttime horizon like a false dawn. Barbaro's most haunting passage comes on the morning of the final assault. He describes standing on the sea walls, watching the Janissaries advance through smoke so thick it blurred the sun. Their arrows fell like black rain, he wrote, and where they struck, men fell screaming not from pain but from the terror of knowing what followed. His clinical training collapses in one raw line. I bandaged wounds until my hands were red to the wrists, and still they came. When the breach became inevitable, Barbaro joined the panicked rush to the harbor, where Venetian ships were cutting ropes to flee. His final entry, scratched aboard a departing galley, simply reads, "The city burns behind us. God has turned his face away." Other voices fill in the gaps left by Barbaro's escape. The Greek scholar George S. Francis, a close friend of Emperor Constantine, recorded the wrenching moment he learned of the emperor's death. "They showed me his purple boots," he wrote, "and I knew then that Rome had truly fallen." His chronicle shifts from grief to grotesque detail: Ottoman troops parading severed heads on pikes, the stench of corpses choking the streets, looters melting church relics for their gold. But it's his account of the Hagia Sophia's desecration that chills most. Priests chanting the liturgy even as axes splintered the doors, the echoes of their hymns drowned by the screams of those being dragged away in chains. Then there's the Ottoman perspective. Tursun Beg, a young officer in Mehmed's army, wrote of the sack with unsettling ambivalence. He describes the Sultan's triumphant entry into the Hagia Sophia, but also his shocked pause at seeing blood pooling between the marble tiles. Even conquest has its costs, Tursun mused, noting how Mehmed ordered the building cleansed with rosewater before his first prayer. The most surprising account comes from an anonymous Russian slave in the Ottoman camp, whose diary survived in fragments. He tells of janissaries secretly shielding Greek families, of Muslim soldiers sharing bread with Christian prisoners, writing, "In war, even hell has moments of mercy." These voices, raw, contradictory, achingly human, transform the siege from a historical event into something visceral. When Barbaro writes of the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, or S. Francis describes clutching his children as their neighborhood burned, history stops being abstract. We're no longer observers of the past, we're standing beside them in the smoke, hearing the same distant cries, facing the same unimaginable choices. That's the power of eyewitnesses. They don't just tell us what happened, they force us to feel it. The news of Constantinople's fall rippled across Europe like a seismic shockwave, leaving rulers and clergy in a rare moment of collective dread. In Rome, Pope Pius II collapsed to his knees upon hearing the report, his attendants later claiming he wept for hours. To Christendom, this wasn't just the loss of a city. It was the unraveling of a spiritual and strategic bulwark that had shielded Europe from the East for centuries. Almost immediately, the Pope drafted impassioned letters to every major European court, framing Mehmed's victory as an existential threat. The Turk now has his dagger at Europe's throat, he warned, demanding an immediate crusade to reclaim the city and avenge the blood of our brothers. His rhetoric was fiery, but the response was tepid. Kings and princes offered sympathetic words, yet their coffers remained closed, their armies unmoved. The reasons for Europe's inertia reveal a continent fractured by self-interest. In France, King Charles VII was preoccupied with rebuilding after the 100 Years' War, his treasury drained and his nobles restless. England, still reeling from the Wars of the Roses, had no appetite for distant battles. Spain's monarchs were too busy consolidating their kingdoms and expelling Moors from Granada. Even the Habsburgs, who styled themselves as defenders of Christendom, hesitated. Frederick III of Austria feared provoking Ottoman retaliation along his vulnerable borders. Meanwhile, Venice and Genoa, the maritime powers with the most to lose, chose pragmatism over piety. Within months of the siege, Venetian diplomats were secretly negotiating trade treaties with Mehmed, while Genoese bankers extended loans to the Sultan in exchange for protected commercial privileges. Pius II refused to accept reality. In 1459, 6 years after Constantinople's fall, he convened a Grand Council in Mantua, summoning Europe's leaders to finally mount a united crusade. His opening speech was a masterpiece of persuasion, blending apocalyptic warnings with flattery and scripture. Will we idly watch as the infidel devours our lands? He thundered, or will we, like the heroes of old, rise as one? The assembly responded with applause and then excuses. The German princes demanded the Pope fund their armies, the French insisted on guarantees of English participation, and the Italians bickered over command. By the time the council disbanded, the only crusaders recruited were a handful of disillusioned mercenaries. When Pius died in 1464, allegedly while drafting yet another plea for unity, his last words reportedly lamented Europe's short-sightedness. We have abandoned the East, and soon the East will come for us. Beyond politics, the failure stemmed from a deeper shift in priorities. The age of crusading fervor had waned, replaced by the calculating realpolitik of emerging nation-states. To many Europeans, Constantinople's fall was tragic but distant, a problem for border kingdoms like Hungary or Poland, not for Paris or London. Some humanists even saw Mehmed as a potential ally against their own rivals, with one Florentine scholar suggesting the Sultan could be baptized and turned against Venice. The Church's own credibility had been weakened by corruption and the lingering trauma of the Great Schism, leaving its calls for holy war sounding hollow. Yet the consequences of this inaction were profound. Without a unified European response, Mehmed consolidated his gains, turning his gaze westward. By 1480, Ottoman forces had overrun the Balkans, their raids reaching the outskirts of Vienna. The very powers that had dismissed Pius's warnings now scrambled to contain the threat they'd allowed to grow. Venice would spend decades and fortunes fighting losing wars to protect its Mediterranean trade routes, while Spain poured resources into fortifying its coasts against Ottoman corsairs. The fall of Constantinople didn't just mark the end of Byzantium. It exposed the fractures in Europe's collective identity, proving that faith alone couldn't unite kingdoms when self-preservation dictated otherwise. In the end, Pius's unrealized crusade became a poignant epitaph for an era when Christendom still believed it could shape the world through shared purpose. The New Age belonged to those who understood power not as a divine mandate, but as a game of cold calculation, and Mehmed had mastered it first. The crumbling of Constantinople's walls didn't just mark the end of an empire, it shattered a 1,000-year-old cultural vessel, sending fragments of Byzantium scattering across the Mediterranean. For centuries, the city had been the guardian of antiquity's wisdom, its libraries preserving works by Plato, Aristotle, and Homer while Europe languished in feudal chaos. Now, as Ottoman soldiers hauled away cartloads of plundered manuscripts for kindling or scrap, a quiet exodus began. Greek scholars, their robes stuffed with salvaged texts, fled aboard Venetian galleys to Italian port cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome. They carried not just parchment but an entire intellectual tradition, one that would ignite the Renaissance like a spark to dry tinder. The irony was profound. Byzantium had long viewed itself as the heir to Rome's grandeur, yet in death it gifted that legacy to the very Latin West it had scorned. Humanist scholars like Francesco Filelfo in Florence paid handsomely for refugee tutors to teach them classical Greek, unlocking direct access to philosophies Europe had known only through fragmented Arabic translations. Suddenly, Plato's dialogues could be read as their author intended, not filtered through centuries of medieval commentary. The impact was electric. When the elderly philosopher Gemistos Plethon lectured in Florence on Plato's Republic, his ideas so enthralled Cosimo de' Medici that he founded the Platonic Academy, an institution that would shape thinkers from Michelangelo to Galileo. But this knowledge transfer came at a cost. The scholars who reached Italy were often destitute, selling their expertise to survive. Theodoros Gaza, once a renowned teacher in Constantinople, ended up cataloging the Vatican Library for Pope Nicholas V. Others, like Cardinal Bessarion, tried to preserve Byzantium's spirit by donating their libraries to Venice, only to watch the books gather dust in warehouses for decades. The diaspora's greatest tragedy, though, lay in what was left behind. Thousands of manuscripts that couldn't be carried, liturgical texts, scientific treatises, imperial archives, were lost to fire, rot, or repurposing as Ottoman ledger paper. An entire dimension of Byzantine thought vanished overnight, leaving gaps in history we'll never fill. Politically, the empire's collapse redrew the map of power. The Ottoman conquest severed Europe's overland trade routes to Asia, spurring explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama to seek new paths across the oceans, an unintended consequence that would reshape global economics. Meanwhile, Russia's grand princes began calling Moscow the Third Rome, claiming Byzantium's orthodox mantle with a zeal that still influences geopolitics today. Even the papacy's authority wavered. Without Byzantium as a counterweight, the Protestant Reformation found fertile ground in a Europe no longer fixated on external threats. Yet for all these seismic shifts, Byzantium's most enduring legacy might be the simplest: resilience. In pockets from Crete to Corsica, Greek communities preserved their language, faith, and customs under Ottoman rule, quietly keeping alive the embers of their culture. When Greece finally won independence in 1829, its revivalists didn't model their new state on contemporary Europe. They reached back to Byzantium's laws, art, and even its double-headed eagle emblem. The empire had fallen, but its memory became a blueprint for rebirth. That paradox defines Byzantium's end not as a clean break, but as a transformation where defeat scattered seeds that would grow in soils far from home. Mehmed II wasted no time reshaping Constantinople into the beating heart of his burgeoning empire. Within days of the conquest, he issued a decree ordering the repopulation of the hollowed-out city, offering tax exemptions, free housing, and even cash incentives to artisans, merchants, and scholars willing to relocate. Families from across the Ottoman territories, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Turks poured into the empty neighborhoods, their carts laden with tools, looms, and handwritten manuscripts. The Sultan personally oversaw the relocation of entire guilds, transplanting weavers from Bursa, potters from Iznik, and metalworkers from Edirne to jumpstart the economy. But this wasn't just resettlement, it was meticulous social engineering. Mehmed positioned communities strategically: Greek fishermen along the Golden Horn's docks, Armenian goldsmiths near the Grand Bazaar's future site, Jewish physicians close to the new imperial hospitals. Within 5 years, the population tripled, its diversity becoming the city's defining trait. Architecture became Mehmed's most visible statement of power. Where Byzantine emperors had built churches to glorify God, the conqueror commissioned mosques to showcase Ottoman supremacy. The Hagia Sophia's conversion set the tone, its Christian altar replaced by a mihrab, its bells silenced in favor of the call to prayer echoing from newly erected minarets. Yet Mehmed's ambitions stretched beyond adaptation. He broke ground on the Fatih Mosque complex, a sprawling hub of worship, education, and welfare that would anchor the city's skyline. Designed by the Persian architect Sinan, its dome deliberately rivaled the Hagia Sophia's in scale, a symbolic assertion that Ottoman Istanbul would outshine its predecessor. Surrounding it rose madrasas teaching Islamic law, soup kitchens feeding the poor, and a hospital offering free care to all faiths. This wasn't just a mosque, it was the blueprint for an entire Islamic ecosystem. Water, the lifeblood of any great city, became an obsession. Mehmed restored the cracked Byzantine aqueducts, but his engineers went further, digging underground cisterns, repairing the Valens aqueduct's arches, and constructing ornate public fountains where citizens could drink beneath Quranic inscriptions. The Grand Bazaar, initially a modest vaulted marketplace, expanded into a labyrinth of over 3,000 shops, its corridors organized by trade. Silks here, spices there, slaves and precious metals in guarded inner courtyards. European visitors marveled at its order, comparing it favorably to the chaotic markets of Venice or Genoa. Mehmed's most radical move, however, was embracing Constantinople's past while erasing its political identity. He adopted the title Caesar I Rum, Caesar of Rome, claiming direct succession from Byzantium's emperors. Byzantine palace officials found themselves retained as advisors, their knowledge of taxation and diplomacy too valuable to discard. The Sultan even commissioned portraits from Italian painters, posing with a mix of European royal regalia and Ottoman turbans. Yet the old street names vanished, replaced by Turkish counterparts, and the Greek Patriarchate was relocated to a modest quarter far from the city center. Istanbul, as it increasingly became known, was neither fully Eastern nor Western, but something new. A hybrid imperial capital where the call to prayer mingled with church bells, where Persian poetry was recited in taverns serving Greek wine. By the time of Mehmed's death in 1481, the city bore little resemblance to the shattered conquest of 1453. Canals once clogged with siege debris now sparkled under arched bridges. The slave market still operated, but beside them stood libraries where scholars pored over Greek geometry texts translated into Arabic. The Janissaries who had stormed the walls now patrolled streets where Venetian merchants haggled with Syrian spice traders. This metamorphosis wasn't mere rebuilding. It was the birth of a cosmopolitan ideal, one where the Ottomans didn't just replace Byzantium but absorbed and transcended it. The world had never seen a city quite like this, a crossroads of civilizations draped in the silks of a new empire, yet threaded with the memories of all that came before. The fall of Constantinople didn't just mark the end of an empire, it birthed a tapestry of myths that blurred the line between history and legend. Among the most haunting is the tale of Constantine XI's disappearance. As Ottoman troops poured through the shattered gates, the last Byzantine emperor was said to have torn off his imperial insignia, drawn his sword, and charged into the fray, vanishing into the smoke of battle. But in the years that followed, whispers spread among Greek refugees that he hadn't truly died. Some claimed an angel had spirited him away, transforming him into marble beneath the Golden Horn's waters, where he slumbered until the day Constantinople would rise again. Others swore that on misty mornings his ghostly figure could be seen pacing the ruined walls, still clad in battle-worn armor, waiting for his return. This myth of the Marble Emperor became a lifeline for displaced Greeks, a promise that their lost world might one day be restored. Even Mehmed II reportedly sent divers to search the harbor, not for treasure, but to disprove the rumor that his rival still lived. Equally enduring is the legend of the Kerkoport, a gate the tiny postern left treacherously ajar at the siege's climax. Some accounts blame the Genos, suggesting mercenaries betrayed the city for Ottoman gold. Others point to a simple oversight, a weary guard neglecting his post after weeks of relentless bombardment. But folklore transformed this pivotal moment into something darker. A popular tale claimed the gate had been opened by a monk who, despairing of Byzantine corruption, believed God had ordained the city's fall as punishment. As the Janissaries rushed in, he was said to have laughed madly before vanishing. Some versions say he was struck by lightning, others that he dissolved into shadow. The story served as a moral lesson. Even the mightiest defenses could crumble from within. Then there's the prophecy of the red apple. Ottoman mystics had long spoken of a fabled fruit representing the ultimate prize of conquest, and after 1453 they declared Constantinople its embodiment. But the legend took an unexpected twist. Some Greek seers reinterpreted it, claiming that apple would one day roll back into Christian hands, a subtle defiance that kept hope alive under Ottoman rule. Centuries later, during Greece's War of Independence in the 1800s, rebels marched into battle shouting for the red apple, proving how myths could outlive empires. Perhaps the most poignant of these tales is the miracle of the Hagia Sophia. As Ottoman axes splintered its doors, elderly priests were said to have continued chanting the liturgy until the very moment soldiers reached the altar. Then, according to witnesses, the last officiant vanished into the church's southern wall, taking the sacraments with him. A fresco of the Virgin Mary nearby reportedly turned its face away in grief. Mehmed, upon hearing this, allegedly forbade anyone from touching that section of the wall, and to this day, guides in Istanbul point to a faint outline where the priest might reappear when the cathedral becomes Christian once more. These stories, whether born from trauma, faith, or sheer human stubbornness, reveal something profound. History records facts, but myths preserve longing. They transform military defeat into spiritual resistance and a fallen emperor into an eternal symbol. The Ottomans may have claimed Constantinople's streets, but its soul, as these legends insist, was never truly conquered. The siege of Constantinople didn't just change empires, it rewrote the playbook of warfare itself. The Ottomans demonstrated terrifying innovations, starting with their use of gunpowder as the great equalizer against centuries-old fortifications. Mehmed's massive cannons, particularly Orban's monstrous bombard, proved that no wall, no matter how thick, was invincible to sustained artillery fire. But brute force alone didn't win the day. The Sultan's true genius lay in combining new technology with psychological mastery. His relentless barrage wasn't random. It followed a calculated rhythm designed to exhaust defenders, with guns firing in shifts to maintain constant pressure while avoiding overheating. This systematic approach to bombardment became the blueprint for sieges across Europe, from Malta to Vienna, where artillery would no longer be an accessory but the centerpiece of assault. Yet the Byzantines weren't mere victims of technological disruption. Their defensive adaptations showed remarkable ingenuity under pressure. Workers hung thick woolen curtains and stretched ox hides along the ramparts to absorb cannonball impacts, an early form of blast mitigation that military engineers would later refine into earthwork berms. Their underground counter-mining operations became textbook examples of tunnel warfare, with defenders using drums of water to detect vibrations from Ottoman sappers, then flooding tunnels or collapsing them with controlled explosions. Even their use of Greek fire, though diminished from its medieval heyday, demonstrated how legacy weapons could still inflict terror when deployed unpredictably. The siege also exposed critical vulnerabilities in traditional defense systems. Constantinople's legendary triple walls, designed to stop medieval armies, became death traps when breached. Narrow passageways between each layer funneled defenders into kill zones where Ottoman arquebusiers could pick them off with horrifying efficiency. This flaw forced military architects across Europe to rethink urban fortifications, leading to the angled bastions and star-shaped designs of the Renaissance that could better withstand and deflect cannon fire. The lesson was clear: static defenses had to evolve or become tombs. Logistics emerged as the unsung hero of Mehmed's campaign. While Byzantine defenders starved behind their walls, the Ottomans maintained an unbroken supply chain stretching hundreds of miles back to Anatolia. Engineers built portable bridges to cross rivers, while herds of cattle were driven alongside the army for fresh meat. Most strikingly, Mehmed established mobile hospitals, tented infirmaries staffed by Jewish and Arab physicians that could treat wounded soldiers near the front lines. This holistic approach to warfare, where supply chains and medical care were as vital as swords and cannons, became standard practice for expanding empires. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the siege demonstration of combined arms tactics. Mehmed didn't rely on any single weapon or strategy. He orchestrated naval blockades, artillery barrages, sapper tunnels, and psychological warfare into a relentless symphony of pressure. When the chain blocked his fleet, he hauled ships over land. When frontal assaults faltered, he used feints and misinformation to spread defenders thin. This multidimensional approach foreshadowed modern warfare's complexity, where victory goes to those who can synergize disparate elements into overwhelming force. The human factor proved just as decisive. The Byzantines' reliance on foreign mercenaries like Giustinian's Genos contingent showed both the value and peril of hired blades. Their skills were unmatched, but their loyalty evaporated the moment pay or survival was threatened. Meanwhile, Mehmed's Janissaries' child conscripts, raised as fanatically loyal soldiers, demonstrated the power of institutionalized military culture. Their disciplined advances under fire, their willingness to die without breaking ranks, set a new standard for professional armies. In the centuries that followed, European monarchs would increasingly move away from feudal levies toward standing armies, recognizing that training and cohesion mattered more than numbers. Constantinople's fall also marked the beginning of asymmetric warfare's golden age. As massive fortresses became vulnerable to artillery, defenders shifted to guerrilla tactics, harassing supply lines, launching night raids, and melting into civilian populations. The Byzantines' last-ditch mobilization of monks and shopkeepers as makeshift soldiers previewed the total war concept, where entire societies became combatants. Future rebellions, from the Spanish guerrillas against Napoleon to modern insurgencies, would draw from this playbook of resistance against technologically superior foes. Hidden within these military lessons lies a sobering truth about the nature of progress in warfare. The siege didn't just showcase new tools, it revealed how quickly yesterday's invincible defenses could become tomorrow's killing fields. For all their courage, the Byzantines were ultimately trapped by their own reliance on past glories. while the Ottomans triumphed by embracing change without abandoning timeless principles of adaptability and psychological dominance. The cannons that breached Constantinople's walls didn't just herald the end of an empire, they announced a new era where innovation, not tradition, would decide the fate of nations. Even today, military academies study this siege not as ancient history, but as a masterclass in the brutal calculus of conquest. Beneath the bustling streets of modern Istanbul, the physical scars of 1453 still whisper to those who know where to look. Recent archaeological digs have unearthed startling remnants of the Theodosian walls, their battered stones revealing the brutal mathematics of Mehmed's cannons. Some sections show impact craters nearly 2 meters deep, clustered in patterns that match historical accounts of concentrated bombardment. In 2018, workers expanding a metro line stumbled upon a previously unknown section of the moat, its jagged edges filled with Ottoman arrowheads and broken swords, evidence of the desperate hand-to-hand combat that raged in the final hours. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came in 2021, when ground-penetrating radar detected a network of tunnels near the Mesotitian. These weren't Byzantine escape routes as initially theorized, but Ottoman sapper corridors, some still littered with 15th-century pickaxes, and the skeletal remains of miners buried alive during counter-siege collapses. The Golden Horn's muddy depths have surrendered secrets too. Marine archaeologists mapping the seabed in 2019 identified the twisted remnants of the Great Chain, its iron links now crusted with centuries of marine growth. Nearby, the outlines of sunken Venetian galleys, their hulls scorched by Greek fire, confirm eyewitness accounts of the naval clashes that preceded Mehmed's audacious overland ship maneuver. Even the legendary Kirkaporta Gate, long thought to be purely mythical, was tentatively located in 2023 beneath a parking lot near the Blashnyi Palace. Soil analysis revealed a concentration of Ottoman-era nails and hinges, suggesting a frantic last stand at this once-forgotten entrance. Cutting-edge technology is rewriting siege narratives. Laser scans of the Hagia Sophia's plastered over mosaics have uncovered hidden graffiti left by defenders' crude crosses scratched into marble, next to Ottoman numerals marking ammunition stockpiles. In the Grand Bazaar's subterranean storerooms, researchers using thermal imaging found charred grain silos dating to the siege's final weeks, proof of the starvation that gripped the city. Most remarkably, DNA extracted from mass graves near the Edirne Gate in 2022 traced victims' origins across 3 continents. Greek locals buried beside Genos mercenaries and even a handful of Janissaries, their bones intermingled in death as they never were in life. These discoveries do more than confirm historical texts, they humanize them. The shattered spine of a young archer found slumped against the inner wall, his vertebrae fused from years of pulling heavy bows. The delicate gold earring tucked inside a cooking pot near the sea walls, perhaps hidden by a woman hoping to retrieve it later. Even Mehmed's siege camp has left traces. Soil samples from the Maltep district show abnormal concentrations of lead and sulfur, residues from the massive cannon foundries he erected on-site. Each fragment stitches another thread into the tapestry of that fateful spring, reminding us that behind the grand narratives of empires clashing were ordinary people, some terrified, some defiant, all caught in a cataclysm that would echo through time. The most poignant revelation came in 2020, when restorers working on the Kora church uncovered a previously unknown fresco beneath layers of Ottoman plaster. It depicts St. George not in his usual heroic stance but slumped against a broken sword, his armor cracked, his face resigned. The date scratched beside it matches the siege's final week. This isn't the triumphant saint of legend, but a weary soldier staring at inevitable defeat. In that single image, archaeology gives us something no chronicle ever could: the visceral weight of despair pressing down on those last defenders, their faith bending but not yet broken as the walls crumbled around them. For nearly 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the vital hinge connecting Europe to the riches of Asia, a gateway where spices from India, silk from China, and gold from Africa flowed into eager Venetian and Genoese hands. But when the Ottomans raised their banners over the city's shattered walls in 1453, they didn't just conquer a capital, they seized the world's most lucrative choke point. Almost overnight, the traditional land routes that had fueled Mediterranean commerce withered under Ottoman tolls and restrictions. Caravans that once traversed the Silk Road now faced exorbitant taxes, while Venetian merchants watched helplessly as their warehouses in Constantinople were confiscated. The economic shockwaves rippled from Cairo to Cologne as prices for pepper, cloves, and other Eastern luxuries skyrocketed. A pound of ginger that once cost 1 ducat in Venice now demanded 12, sending European markets into panic. The Ottomans, far from being mere destroyers, proved shrewd economic strategists. They didn't sever the trade routes, but bottlenecked them, turning geography into profit. This calculated squeeze forced Europe into an existential dilemma: find new paths to the east or face ruin. Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator had already been probing Africa's coast, seeking a sea route around the continent, but now his efforts took on urgent significance. By 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving Asia could be reached without Ottoman interference. Yet it was Christopher Columbus's infamous westward gamble in 1492 that revealed the full desperation of the moment. His quest wasn't just exploration, it was an end run around Mehmed's heirs, a Hail Mary pass thrown across the Atlantic. The irony is staggering. The fall of Constantinople, an event that seemed to signal Islamic dominance, inadvertently triggered the European voyages that would redraw the global map. The Ottomans themselves underestimated the long-term consequences. Their control of the Bosporus initially brought staggering wealth. Customs duties from the spice trade alone funded entire military campaigns. But by monopolizing rather than expanding trade, they inadvertently spurred their rivals to innovate. Spanish and Portuguese ships, once minor players in Mediterranean commerce, now ventured into uncharted oceans. The caravel, a nimble vessel developed for African exploration, became the workhorse of these new maritime empires. Meanwhile, the Italian city-states that had grown fat on overland trade found themselves sidelined. Venice's once mighty fleet now rotted in its lagoons, while Lisbon and Seville buzzed with cartographers, shipwrights, and adventurers plotting routes to bypass Ottoman territory entirely. Goods weren't the only commodities rerouted by Constantinople's fall. The collapse of Byzantine networks scattered Greek scholars westward, carrying not just manuscripts but commercial knowledge. Florentine bankers pored over rediscovered Ptolemaic maps, while Portuguese navigators hired Jewish cartographers expelled from Istanbul. This brain drain supercharged Europe's technical prowess. Ship designs improved, navigation tools refined, and the very mindset of exploration shifted from cautious coastal hugging to bold oceanic leaps. The Ottoman grip on trade had unintentionally created a competitive free-for-all, where the rewards went to those willing to risk the unknown. Yet the story isn't one of simple European triumph. Ottoman control also reshaped Eastern trade dynamics. With Constantinople now Istanbul, Persian and Arab merchants found their traditional overland routes to the Black Sea severed, pushing them to develop Red Sea and Indian Ocean alternatives. This spurred the rise of ports like Aden and Hormuz, while the Mamluks in Egypt grew rich, taxing the redirected spice flow. The ripple effects reached as far as the Swahili coast, where Zanzibar's markets boomed with goods funneled around Ottoman domain. The world hadn't just expanded westward, it had fractured into competing circulatory systems, each seeking ways around the other's blockades. What began as a siege in 1453 ended up restructuring global economics in ways no one could have predicted. The Age of Discovery, often painted as a purely European phenomenon, was in many ways a desperate reaction to Ottoman dominance. The silver mined in Spanish America, the cloves harvested in the Moluccas, even the enslaved Africans transported across the Middle Passage. All these horrors and wonders can be traced back to that pivotal moment when the gates of Constantinople swung shut to Christian traders. The Ottomans won the city, but in doing so, they unwittingly turned the world's gaze outward, setting in motion an era of exploration, exploitation, and encounters that would make their own empire just one player in a suddenly vast and interconnected world. The true legacy of 1453 wasn't just a change of rulers, it was the birth of globalization itself. Constantinople's fall has haunted the imagination of storytellers for centuries, morphing from historical event into cultural mythos across films, novels, and games. Hollywood's most famous take, The Conquest of Constantinople, 1951, dramatized the siege with sweeping battle scenes but played fast and loose with facts depicting Emperor Constantine as a white-bearded sage rather than the 49-year-old warrior he was, and inventing a doomed romance between a Venetian mercenary and a Byzantine noblewoman to add melodrama. The film's climactic breach of the walls, while visually stunning, condensed weeks of artillery bombardment into a single dramatic afternoon, erasing the grueling attrition that defined the real siege. Yet its greatest sin might be reducing Mehmed II to a snarling villain, ignoring his intellectual curiosity and strategic brilliance, a simplification that persists in many Western portrayals. Literature has often been kinder to historical nuance. The Dark Angel, a 1989 novel by Mika Waltari, immerses readers in the siege's chaos through the eyes of a Greek physician torn between loyalty to Byzantium and fascination with Ottoman culture. Waltari's meticulous research shines in scenes like the clandestine shipment of relics to Venice, or the eerie quiet between cannon volleys when defenders could hear the Ottomans' evening prayers. But even here, creative liberties creep in. The book's protagonist witnesses events across the entire city with unlikely omniscience, and Giustiniani's fatal wound is relocated to the Hagia Sophia for symbolic weight. Video games take the most liberties while paradoxically preserving tactical truths. Assassin's Creed Revelations 2011 lets players scale Constantinople's walls as an Ottoman assassin, blending architectural accuracy with fantasy. The Hagia Sophia's interior is painstakingly recreated, yet the game inserts secret Templar layers beneath it. Surprisingly, its depiction of Mehmed's land-based naval maneuver is spot-on, complete with greased logs and oxen teams. Meanwhile, medieval Roman II, Total War's siege mechanics capture the defenders' desperation, players managing crumbling walls, dwindling supplies, and the morale shock of Giustiniani's retreat. Though the game absurdly lets players win as Byzantium, rewriting history with a mouse click. Even music has wrestled with the siege legacy. The heavy metal band Iced Earth's The Glorious Burden album features a 9-minute epic, The Fall of Constantinople, blending Janissary march rhythms with lyrics drawn from eyewitness accounts. The song's bridge recreates the moment the Kirkaport, a gate, fell, using actual Byzantine chant samples, a rare instance of popular culture honoring the event's spiritual gravity. What unites these varied portrayals is their struggle to balance spectacle with substance. The real siege was a slow-motion tragedy of logistics and exhaustion, but that doesn't sell tickets or keep gamers engaged. So we get clashing armies instead of starving civilians, heroic last stands instead of the quiet despair of monks burning their libraries. Yet in their flaws, these adaptations reveal something profound. The fall of Constantinople isn't just history, it's a mirror, refracting our own fears about cultural collapse, the clash of civilizations, and the fragility of greatness. Whether painted as heroic tragedy or inevitable progress, it remains a story we can't stop retelling, because deep down, we're still trying to understand how empires vanish, and what, if anything, endures after the walls fall. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the collapse of a city, it was the moment the tectonic plates of history shifted, sending shockwaves we still feel today. When the last Roman emperor fell on that bloody May morning in 1453, it marked more than the end of Byzantium. it redrew the map of power, trade, and faith in ways that shaped our modern world. Europe, suddenly cut off from eastern trade routes, was forced to look westward, launching the age of exploration that would connect continents for better and worse. The Ottoman Empire, now straddling two continents, became the bridge between Islam and Christendom, a role that still echoes in Turkey's geopolitical balancing act today. Even Russia's identity as the Third Rome, claiming Byzantium's orthodox legacy, fuels its imperial ambitions to this day. But the siege's true lesson isn't just about empires rising and falling. It's about the fragility of walls, both stone and symbolic. The Byzantines believed their triple defenses were impregnable, just as civilizations throughout history have trusted in their own unshakable dominance. Yet Constantinople's downfall reminds us that no fortress, no matter how mighty, can withstand the relentless tide of change when innovation, ambition, and desperation collide. Mehmed's cannons didn't just break through medieval walls, they shattered an entire worldview, proving that adaptation, not tradition, decides who thrives in the currents of history. The parallels to our era are striking. The scramble for new trade routes after 1453 mirrors today's tech race for AI and space dominance, both born from the fear of being left behind. The schism between East and West, which doomed Byzantine pleas for unity, still lingers in modern geopolitics, where short-term interests often override collective survival. Even the diaspora of Greek scholars, carrying ancient knowledge to spark the Renaissance, finds its echo in today's brain drains and intellectual migrations reshaping global power. So what does this mean for us? History doesn't repeat, but it whispers patterns. The fall of Constantinople teaches us that civilizations aren't destroyed by invaders alone. They're hollowed out first by infighting, complacency, and the failure to imagine their own vulnerability. Yet it also shows humanity's stubborn resilience, how cultures can transform rather than disappear, how ideas outlast empires, and how even in defeat, legends are born that endure for centuries. This story isn't just locked in the past, it's alive in the streets of Istanbul, where Byzantine columns still stand beside Ottoman minarets, and in every moment when societies face their own existential crossroads. So tell us in the comments, where do you see echoes of 1453 in today's world? And if you want to dive deeper, check out our playlist on history's most pivotal battles, because understanding how walls fall might just help us build stronger ones.